All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 2 of INTP Reasonings. What is this? Well, it's essentially where instead of presenting to you a scripted or formatted talk on some subject, which isn't bad, it's got its strengths, instead I'm going to reason out loud my natural thought processes. And in that process, we're going to determine what's actually true about what new conclusions can we come to. And I think this style of thinking has the highest likelihood of coming to a deep truth or realization that will actually further our understanding of human behavior and who we are as people and how to understand other people, which is my goal. All right. I'll get started here in a second, but first I got to tell you, this is going to be audio only. So I'm going to turn off the camera here and I'm just going to go in my head and just speak into the microphone as fluently as I can what I'm thinking. And then I will upload it. And hopefully this turned out to be something productive. So here we go. So first I want to talk about what is a personality type anyway? We've got all these things supposedly called cognitive functions that are laid out according to certain attitudes we have towards them. For example, your first function is your hero function, meaning that it's your dominant part of yourself that you tend to use as your main trait. So if you're the INTP, for example, it's reasoning out loud and being like, okay, what is this really? Like, if this is true and that's true, if my dog is brown, I read an article that says genetics have this effect on dogs, and I see my dog doing this and it doesn't match up with the article on genetics, I'll be like, well, that can't be true because of that. That's typical TI thinking, specifically TI-SI thinking, which is another issue. So I'm just what sparked this particular talk is I saw some debating about what personality type people in the community actually are. It's like, oh yeah, he's an ENTJ, clearly. You probably know who I'm talking about. No, he's an ENTP. No, he's an INFJ. What? And the fact that there is so much disagreement about these things makes me concerned because I'm like, well, if there's so much disagreement, how can it be possible that this stuff is accurate? Shouldn't there be some sort of standard that we can come to? Which is why you have people like DaveSuperPowers, which over the course of 5 or 6 years have developed their own systems for typing people that they have a specific methodology for. What they do is they separately type someone and then they compare their results. And if they can consistently get the same results as each other, it is accurate and precise enough, or at least precise enough, for them to conclude, okay, these are the results, this is accurate. But then I see other people in the community arguing, well, no, maybe you're not asking the right questions in the first place. Like Eric Thor, for example, which differs from DaveSuperPowers in the way that he defines these things. DaveSuperPowers defines these things in a sense where, okay, these things are different. Like we're focusing on the behaviors of people, and can we classify people based on how they act, what they say, what we can glean about them from these metrics of the animals like blasts, consume, sleep, etc., observers, deciders, etc. These are this is the nomenclature for the DaveSuperPowers system. Whereas Eric Thor is like, I want to focus on the motivations. What's more important is the motivations that are driving us to act the way we do. And he recently released a test that asks you, do you enjoy this activity when you're at your best? Are you an entertaining person when you're at your best? When you're actually who you want to be, are you entertaining other people? Things like that. And then there's the cognitive functions test, which is another thing. It's like you take this test and it tells you, based on the function-related answers, like, do you plan things? Do you use your memory like this? But in any case, here's the problem. All of these tests, the problem is words on a screen that you answer, you're obviously going to be biased to some extent, because how well can you really know yourself? How do you define these things? This is the problem with soft sciences in general. The fact that we are categorizing things based on behaviors and things that we observe subjectively, as opposed to science where you can look at a meter that says, okay, the Geiger count in this room is 500. Because we can have standards for Geiger counters that are so accurate, the Geiger counters can be trusted by a wide variety of people. You can trust that no matter, and this is how really I think we should, and Jordan Peterson says this too somewhere in one of his videos, is the way we define things should be something along the lines of, if you can repeatedly test it to be true and act on it and effectively it works, then it's effectively true. Okay. And so when I see people arguing about personality types and stuff, I go back to this reference, this axiom of thinking. Well, can you repeatedly see these patterns in how someone acts or behaves or what they say? Can you find a way to guarantee that these patterns are predictable and accurate to what's actually going on there? And then you can get into deeper questions. So based on that, okay, what is causing these patterns? Why does someone have a pattern that they do? Is it what causes us to act the way we do? I think this is a lot of the question that people are asking. And you could look at various disciplines, let's say, to find relevant answers. Like in neuroscience, they're like, okay, well, your brain is wired so that when your neurons are firing, it makes you tend, people also disagree. Well, no, the mind is not the brain. Okay. And it's agreeing on these things that is necessary, I think, to come to real, deep, long-lasting truths about who we are as people in ways that we can use for real in our lives. Okay, so based on that, we all know we're looking for some sort of consistency here. So what I'm going to try to do is just reason out, just ask questions the most innocent way I can, just the most basic way I can, and just try to answer them as we go. Okay, so what is a cognitive function? Well, the very name implies that it's something in your cognition that does something, some functions in some way. Specifically, it's something that takes in information. That information can be, what is information? Information is organization. Information is the opposite of chaos. Information is order. So the cognitive functions are taking in data and organizing it and putting it into some sort of order. That's what they are. Okay, so how does your brain do this? Is it your brain that does this? Well, what else could it be? You take in information through your senses. That's extroverted sensing. You take information from within. That's introverted sensing. As in, you look into your memory or into how you feel within your body. That's it. Well, that's the question, though. Is information from within your body introverted sensing or extroverted sensing? How do we define these things? Because it's the definitions, we need to have some sort of reliable, agreed upon definition so that we know what we're talking about. Because if we don't, then there's no way to come to a consistent truth about these things. And so we need to know what exactly is introverted sensing and what is extroverted sensing. And same for all the other functions that have been postulated. So I'm just going to try to reason this out. If I can feel my heartbeat, is that introverted sensing or extroverted sensing? Since no one else can feel my heartbeat, you could imply that that's introverted sensing because it's not information that everyone has access to objectively. And part of the definition that we tend to use for these things is extroverted means it's objective, introverted means it's subjective. So I think that for the purposes here is the way we're going to think about this. Introverted sensing is the subjective experience that can't be measured by others easily or at all. And extroverted sensing is the objective experience that people can also agree upon just by looking, okay, yeah, that is green. Even if it's not the same green as your green, because we do perceive colors differently. Some people have multiple cones in their eyes as opposed to, like, they're tetrachromatic, so they have 4 types of color receptors in their eyes, whereas most people have 3, and some colorblind people only have 2. Okay? So it's going to change. So in so far, what we've figured out here is that in a way, a lot of this has some looseness to it. It's hard to come to an absolute rigidity about this, which is what makes it frustrating. But it's also true that you can see statistically, because it's not always going to be 100% precise. That's what statistics are for. Statistics are actually looking for the average or the normative truth of something as opposed to the absolute truth. So I actually tend to think more statistically when I have the option to do so. So instead of looking at, okay, this is hard, absolute logic, the more fuzzy logic of statistics is like, okay, well, if you use the term extroverted thinking, this correlates with this tendency in someone's behavior. but it's also valuable to try to be exact if we can. So in the case of introverted versus extroverted sensing, let's say a doctor has a stethoscope and then listens to your heartbeat. What is the difference? When can you define that as introverted versus extroverted sensing? Because clearly you both know and can agree on your heartbeat. Well, here's the distinction. The introverted sensing is your personal direct experience of the heartbeat internally. So if you put a stethoscope to your own ears and listen to your heartbeat, the feeling you have internally of your heartbeat would be introverted sensing, and the feeling in the stethoscope would be extroverted sensing. Is what you hear in the stethoscope, what you're picking up with your ears as opposed to through your proprioception. And I believe that's a valid enough definition. If you disagree, I'm interested because it's important that we get these things correct. So with that in mind, let's take a look at depth psychology and the INTP as an example, or we could use the INTJ or anyone who has third slot sensing. So the INTP has third slot sensing, introverted sensing, and seventh slot extroverted sensing. Now, other systems like socionics, et cetera, they say that your seventh function is your weakest. So for the INTP, extroverted sensing would be their weakest, whereas introverted sensing would be their third function, which it's not necessarily that it's weaker, according to what I've been taught by the various people in the field. Instead, it's more like introverted sensing is preferred for the INTP. And the same thing for the ENTJ. They have the same strength of sensing as the INTP, if I understand correctly. It's just that the extroverted sensing is preferred for the ENTJ. So that's what they tend to focus on naturally. Whereas they have to go out of their way to focus on introverted sensing, just like I have to go out of my way to focus on extroverted sensing. Something like that. Okay, so based on that, what does it actually mean for the INTP to have polar or blind spot or trickster extroverted sensing? How does that differ from their introverted sensing? Well, let's try to reason it out. I'm currently here and I'm in my body. I feel a little bit worked up. I just worked out. I'm aware of what's just happened. I'm kind of thinking about the different things that I've understood from what people have taught in typology. That, in my understanding, is introverted sensing because it's based on my own inner perception of things. It's a gathering function according to the theory. So it's just pulling in information. So I'm pulling in information more naturally from how I feel internally. Not introverted feeling, that's different. See, it's got to understand the definitions of these things. It's just understanding how I feel. Not even understanding, just being able to directly feel, hey, my fingers, I can feel the throbbing of my heartbeat in my fingers. I can feel the warmth of the air around me. I can see the lights. Well, no. See, there's the distinction again. How can you tell what's introverted versus extroverted? Well, this is the question is like, even if you can define those things, how do you know that extroverted sensing versus introverted sensing, like what's the difference in terms of your brain? Why would you be naturally wired to focus on one or the other? I think that's an important question. What DaveSuperPowers has postulated is that if you are lead T, a lead thinker, you have the same strength of thinking as someone else who's lead T, like an ENTJ versus an INTP. It's just that the INTP just focuses inwardly with that thinking, whereas the ENTJ uses the same sort of processes in the brain, if that's correct, I don't know, to focus externally on what is being thought about in the world. So they're applying that mental capacity externally, whereas the INTP focuses it internally within themselves. But that still leaves the question, what actually causes introverted versus extroverted attitudes towards a function? What makes you the introverted sensing preference as opposed to the extroverted sensing preference? And I think if we can answer this question, it'll help us to uncover truths about other functions. And I think this is a valid way of thinking. Go as deep as you can on one specific idea, and through going to the depths on that one idea, you can come to a more general truth through the insights of plumbing those depths. So we're going to try to plumb in depth on introverted versus extroverted sensing now. So what is it about seventh slot extroverted sensing that causes the INTP and INFP to be unaware of their environment? What does that actually mean? Not taking in information from your external reality. Well, let's put that on the back burner for a second, and let's take a page from lead sensor types. So this would be the SPs and SJs. The ESFP and the ISFJ are both lead sensors. So the ESFP is lead extroverted sensing. The ISFJ is lead introverted sensing. So let me just sort of reason through my experiences with talking to, and I'm also, the fact that I am reasoning through my experiences, that's TISI. That would be introverted thinking and introverted sensing in a loop of thinking. That's what the INTP does. It's also what the ISFJ does, but in the opposite way. So yeah, so let's look at the ESFP. When I talk to ESFPs that I know, they're very in the moment. They're very just like, ooh, this is fun. That's fun. Ooh, I'm joking with you now. Ha ha ha. Oh, now I'm joking with him. Oh, now I'm doing this. This is so fun. Blah, 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 blah. In contrast to the ISFJs that I know, who tend to be into photography, and they're more in depth. They focus more deeply on what it is exactly they're doing. The ISFJs I know tend to be photographers, and they tend to be into sensory experiences like that. Whereas in contrast, the ESFPs I know are more flitzy, or they're less grounded. They're more like, oh, this is fun, that's fun, very in the moment. Whereas the ISFJ is not. They're focused on what's happening, but they're focused on it from their own experience of it. Whereas the ESFP is focused on what's literally happening around them. I mean, just as a thought experiment, imagine yourself that you're sitting there or standing there doing whatever you're doing. Imagine, just sort of think about the difference, okay, between focusing externally. So I'm focusing on the green of a color of a box of a digital signal processor that I have for an audio system. And now I'm focusing on the red logo of a grocery store bag that's sitting next to it. And now I'm focusing on the glow of the lights as they fill the room. Now, what's the difference between introverted and extroverted sensing with that? What's the distinction there? Well, my understanding is that the ISFJ will focus on the little details of the exact way the lines are curving, things like that. I would guess that ISFJs would tend to be graphic designers and photographers and video people and things that are more like that, whereas the ESFP is more likely to be moment to moment stringing little individual things together. So they won't really notice the exact fact that that box is green, and then they won't really even contemplate it like that. They'll just be like, oh, that's cool. I want to do that. That's fun. It's a different thing. In fact, it's pretty foreign to me even to try to discuss this, considering that theoretically that's my weakest ability, to the point I'm not even aware of it really. Another thing I've noticed is that introverted sensors like ISFJs tend to be like, this is some really good pie. This food is so tasty. Nom, 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 nom. Whereas extroverted sensors are like, oh, this is fun. This food, that was fun. Now I'm talking, let's go do this now. More in the moment. They don't really tend to notice. If they do notice the flavors, it's very fleeting. It's just a moment to moment thing. Whereas the introverted sensors really dwell on it. They're like, oh, this is so tasty. And as an INTP, I can confirm that I'm more of the, ooh, this is so tasty, as opposed to, this is fun, let's go do this now. Whereas an ISTP, I know, he's like, he doesn't really comment on the flavor. He's just like, oh yeah, this is happening, blah, blah, blah. Oh, that shirt, I like that shirt, blah, 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 blah. Oh, that's cool, blah, 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 blah. And so it's a bit more fleeting of a function, let's say. Whereas SI is more grounded. But that still doesn't answer the question of what actually causes you to be focused on one or the other. So again, what is going on that actually causes me to focus on the details of all the surfaces in the room and the way the sounds are hitting my ears, as opposed to the extroverted sensors who are more focused in a fleeting way and just moment to moment taking in all the information and holding it and just interacting with it as it's in their mind. I think one thing that's true is that all of the introverted functions are slower than their extroverted counterparts. Not that they're less powerful, they're actually just deeper. It's sort of like going a mile deep and an inch wide versus a mile wide and an inch deep. The extroverted versions would be the mile wide, the introverted versions would be the mile deep. So introverted versions are more focused on detail and things like that, whereas the extroverted versions are just more, oh, this is that, that's that, that's that. Like extroverted feeling is like, oh, that's that feeling, that's this feeling. Extroverted thinking is like, that's that idea, that's this idea. Extroverted sensing is like, ooh, that's that color, that's what's happening there, that's what that is. Extroverted intuition is like, oh, that could be true. Oh, look at that thing in my imagination. Ooh, those ideas could connect together. Ooh, those ideas could connect together. As opposed to their introverted counterparts, introverted sensing is like, ooh, look at the extreme details of all those striations in the wood. And then introverted intuition is like, ooh, look at this really deep structure of this idea. And I'm following it down into the depths of what it is. It's like, ooh, it's bubbling up, taking all these truths and combining them into one deep, meaningful thing. As opposed to extroverted intuition is like, oh, that could be true. That's happening. That could be happening. Sorry. And then there's introverted thinking, which is like really deep thinking as opposed to extroverted thinking, which is more practical thinking. So the introverted thinking takes whatever's in mind and it just is like, okay, this is in mind. Now, compared to this that's also in my mind, how do these relate to each other? Are they accurate? Is there some deeper connection here? I mean, are they true? Not is there a deeper connection? Are they true? Okay, is that true? Okay, cool. Next, okay, is that true? Cool. Is that true? Cool. And it's just going through in this linear process, whereas the extroverted version is more shotgun. It's more like a shotgun. And then introverted feeling, which is my 8th function. So not that I would know how to describe this very well, but it's in comparison to my extroverted feeling, which is like I notice all the feelings in the world. I notice that I can see this person's emotions, that they're in a bad mood. Whereas, so extroverted sensing is similar to that. You can see the experience someone else is getting. It's not how they feel that you're seeing, it's with the experience. Now, if you're an SCFE user, like an ENFJ, an INFJ, an ESTP, and an ISTP, then you can do both simultaneously. And those are the most social types for that reason, because they're the most externally focused on people. SE and FE are the more people functions, whereas TE and NE are more focused on non-people things like objective reality, things like that. So NE is focused on the things that could happen, which is not what the person is experiencing right now, as opposed to, which is what extroverted sensing is. And extroverted thinking is, does this make sense in the other person's brain? Is it effective for them? Is it actually truthful to them? Is it accurate for them? Extroverted feeling is like, does this person feel good about this? Do they value this? Is this working for them from a values standpoint? As an example to the contrast between introverted and extroverted functions, because I have extroverted thinking as my blind spot, extroverted sensing, it means I actually tend to get distracted by those external environments. So if I'm in a busy environment where there's a lot of information to take in, because my introverted sensing is childlike in nature, that's what the theory says, I tend to get easily thrown off by things that draw me out of that. So if I get drawn into extroverted sensing, it kind of throws me off. I think that's how that works. And I think in the same way, if an ENTJ and ENFJ try to focus on their introverted sensing or their internal experience, it actually makes them feel a little bit off balance when it comes to their extroverted sensing. Of course, I think in general that's somewhat true no matter what shadow function you're talking about. The 5th through the 8th functions, I believe that when you're using them, you're going to feel a bit off balance naturally. Whereas if it's your weakest function in the 4th slot, the inferior function or the demon function as DaveSuperPowers calls it, that's actually going to, if you use that function, you actually feel like you're pushing yourself to be a better person, as opposed to the opposing functions, which just feel like you're pushing yourself out of your normal comfort zone. The opposing functions are the same thing as the shadow functions. When I say that, I mean the 5th through the 8th slots. Here's potentially a really good example of the introverted versus extroverted sensing. Another good example. So I'm in my own head thinking on something, right? When I'm thinking internally within my own head, that's an example of TISI. Whereas an ISTP, I know TISE, they are thinking about what's happening around them directly. So I know several ISTPs, and they're like, oh, look, this problem, I'm going to fix it right now. Like, it's like, oh, okay, I see what's happening there. I know what's actually going to work. I'm going to make that problem go away. I know how to be really effective. That's also TE. It's kind of weird because it's not just, see, the functions don't exist in isolation because everyone can use TE, everyone can use TI, same for all the other functions. It's just we're looking for the preferences here. But is that really true? It's just weird to me because there really does seem to be something to it. Because as I reason this out and I look at patterns of people that I have typed as a certain type, they really do tend to fall into certain patterns that match up with the theory. So there's got to be something to it. It's just like, what is that? So to finish my example of introverted thinking and introverted sensing, TISI, as used by the INTP, what that actually is I'm thinking through things in my memory. I'm looking into my memory, things that I know, and comparing them to each other. That's actually what I'm literally doing right now as you listen to me. I'm just comparing ideas to each other. And that's TINESI. That's what that is. Which, in contrast, if someone distracts me and pulls me into the external environment, extroverted sensing, and I have to start paying attention to a piece of wood, well, what the ISTP would do by contrast is they'll actually see that piece of wood and they can like take it and pick it up, and they can understand the piece of wood and what to do with that piece of wood, and use their thinking in TISE fashion and actually externally work with the external environment. Whereas TISI, like the INTP, is working internally in their internal environment. That's how that works. So based on that, it looks like it has something to do with what your brain tends to focus on. Am I focused internally in my memory, or am I taking information in through my ears and directly processing it in the moment? That's the distinction. So in one case, you're taking information in directly from within yourself that you've encoded already, like in your memory, which is introverted sensing, whereas extroverted sensors can take in information directly, this is the key, directly with their eyes and ears and process that instantaneously. Whereas me, TISI, what I actually have to do typically is take in information, process it a little bit, and then work with that processed information. It's interesting how that works. It's very different. And I wonder if you were to ask an ENTJ or ENFJ, I suspect that's not what they do. They process information as they get it. Like a TESE ENTJ, they're like, this is the information I have right now. Okay, what's going to make this information work? Same thing for SCTE. That would be the ESFP, but it's flipped around. They're like, oh, this is the information I have right now. This is fun, ha ha ha. Whereas the ENTJ is like, okay, what's going to work here? I'm going to use the information I have to make it work. The SFP is like, oh, this is the information I have. This is fun, ha ha. Not even thinking about it. They're just so focused on the information. Like, that's a block of wood. Oh, I'm working with this block of wood now. Oh, I'm throwing the volleyball. Oh, I'm playing football, whatever. But my problem with that is it doesn't necessarily answer the question, are you actually better at extroverted sensing or introverted sensing depending on your type, if you are an intuitive type? And what I mean by that is we know that intuitives are generally more focused and probably better at intuition than sensing types. But what I'm not sure about is, as an INTP, does that mean I'm actually worse at extroverted sensing, or is it just that I prefer introverted sensing? So let's just do another thought experiment. I'm going to try to focus on extroverted sensing and see what happens. So if I try to focus on my extroverted sensing, it seems to me like I get into a more in-the-moment style of processing. So I just interact with the world as it is right in front of me right now. And that is what that is. So I'm just like processing it in the moment. It's not even necessarily getting encoded to memory. Whereas because I'm an SI user, my natural preference is to take in information and encode that information that I do get in memory. And I'm focusing on what's in my memory, and I'm trying to work on my internal story and the way things make sense in my own mind, as opposed to, let's say, the ENTJ who has the opposite preferences. They are focused on doing what's effective, and they use information that's right in front of them right now to make that work. Whereas I am the opposite of that. I tend to take in information and reason within myself to figure out what that all means. It's a different way of looking at it, but I do think that generally, if you're a lead T, that's generally the same ability with thinking. It's just that it's focused differently. And this is indeed what DaveSuperPowers says. Now let's flip this around. Let's look at the example of the ESFP and ISFJ again. So they're lead sensors. The ESFP is always focused on what's happening around them, very in the moment, to the point that they tend to neglect what's in their memory. They don't tend to focus on exact details. But based on what the theory says, they're going to be actually pretty good at focusing on exact details. They just don't prefer it. Like Taylor Swift, she's an extroverted sensor, supposedly an ESFP according to the community. She's going to be very good at working with stuff in the moments, but when it comes to actually looking at the deeper details of things, how would she do that? I mean, what is that? Because clearly she has to get caught up in the details of her lyrics and how she sings and stuff. I mean, she is working with professional writers and things like Max Martin. He's a known music industry person who writes songs for pop stars. He wrote Britney Spears songs, Backstreet Boys, Taylor Swift. He's written songs for a lot of people. I think he's written 20-something hit songs. It's crazy. So this doesn't really answer the question of why does the ESFP prefer extroverted sensing? I mean, there's the idea that your brain is actually wired so that it actually rewards you more for pursuing extroverted sensing, and it rewards you less for pursuing introverted sensing. It drains your energy actually to do what you're not wired for doing. Let's try to look at it from my own perspective. If I try to use my extroverted sensing, I can do it, but it takes me a little while to flip into that mode. And then once I'm in that mode, I feel a little bit insecure and out of control because I'm used to focusing on what's in my own brain and using the information I have in my head as like a reference point. But since I'm not doing that, I'm feeling like, oh no, what am I doing? I'm focusing on the external environment and processing it in the moment and thinking on my feet. This is crazy. But as a comparison, if I try to use extroverted thinking and to be effective, I can actually do that pretty effectively and easily. And it doesn't really cause me too many problems with my introverted thinking. I can pretty easily flip back into that mode. Whereas I think it's probably the same for, like, say, the ISFJ and ESFP. The ISFJ introverted sensing lead, focusing on the details of all the colors and striations, they can actually flip into the external mode of what's happening in the world and I know an ISFJ who does this. She focuses on the external world and just interacts with it directly and can flip into that mode and then flip instantly back into her introverted sensing mode. I'm kind of like that with thinking. So I think that actually is accurate, that your first function, you can actually flip between modes. You just prefer, whereas the weaker the function gets, the harder it is for you to flip to the opposite version of that function. Like me, extroverted feeling is my fourth function. And it's very difficult for me to flip into the opposite of that, which is introverted feeling. So I'm always tend to focus on what other people are feeling. You know, do they look sad? How do they feel? It's just that I'm so focused on thinking within my own head that I tend to neglect focusing on that, even though I can do it. And I guess as a result of that, I'm always not sure if I'm not paying enough attention to that. I do care about that. It's just that I'm focused on, I think that's true. That last few couple sentences was me spouting the theory. The theory is that you're so focused on your first function that you tend to neglect your fourth function. So I'm so focused on introverted thinking that I tend to neglect extroverted feeling. Same thing with ESFPs. They're so focused on extroverted sensing, they tend to neglect the deeper meaning of things. ISFJs are so focused on their own internal experience that they tend to neglect what could possibly be true beyond that. And like all the deeper connections of ideas, like what if this happens? What if that happens? And overall, so far in our discussion, I think we've concluded that personality types are a thing. Like we do tend to fall into certain modes, and for some reason I am better at thinking than I am at sensing. And other people are better at sensing than thinking. That really is true. But my question is that like a hardwired thing in your genetics that you're naturally going to be better at thinking? I mean, if I look back at my own experience as a kid, yeah, I was always naturally better at thinking, although I did have times that I was good at sensing as a kid as well. In fact, as a kid, I think you're more malleable, and so you're more open to things in general. And as I remember as a kid, I was generally more fluent in all of the cognitive functions when I was 5 than I am now in my mid-20s. I've also seen people say you can flip between all of the functions on a dime. Like, oh, flip between any function no matter what your type on a dime. I don't think that's necessarily true, and I think maybe they're just spouting stuff. One thing that I think is true is that we can all tend to neglect our non-preferred functions. So an ESFP will tend to get stuck in SCTE, and an INTP will get stuck in TISI, and so on and so forth. So you have to be careful about that. And I think it is worth actively going outside of your comfort zone. And when I say comfort zone, I don't mean routine. I mean the way you think, which is technically going outside of your comfort zone, but the language is kind of looser because typically that means going outside of your routine, which is an SI thing. SC is just like, ooh, this is what's happening. Ooh, this is fun. It's not even that. It's just like, this is what's happening. Back to a little bit earlier in the conversation, I was talking about some people focused on motivations as the primary criteria for determining personality types. That implies to me that you're ignoring that people do have natural strengths and not others. And I think it's those natural strengths, in my opinion, that we should be using as the reference for personality types. Motivations aren't necessarily as accurate. I mean, I'm not sure about that. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, even if I wanted to use extroverted sensing, it takes effort. And by the time I get there, I feel out of control because I'm not in my brain anymore. I don't remember my memory and my thoughts. So it's just this weird thing. You got to be able to do both. To wrap up, I would say that personality types are a thing. We are naturally wired to be better at thinking versus feeling versus sensing versus intuition. And we all have our own strengths and weaknesses. And these systems can actually help us determine these strengths and weaknesses in a fairly repeatable, predictable way. Although I would say that we do need to improve the way these systems work so they're more reliable, so there's less disagreement in the community, some way that's more objective that people can all agree upon. And we can use this stuff to understand other people and understand how people get along with each other. And very specifically, like, okay, I'm not good at this. It would not be wise for me to focus on this in my life because I'm always going to consistently have this problem because I'm literally not wired that way. And likewise, oh, I have this set of weaknesses. I can find someone who has complementary strengths. And by being around those people, it can actually make us both better people just naturally because we're complementing each other. I think it's very interesting, and hopefully you had a good time reasoning along with me. I would have liked to get to some deeper depths in this talk. And I think perhaps it would probably be best to talk with someone else live as opposed to just reasoning by myself. Both have their strengths and weaknesses, but I think probably I should be discussing this with other people as opposed to just presenting my own reasoning. Because we're all human, and when we communicate, that's usually where we get the deepest insights, I think. Not always. I mean, you've got Albert Einstein, but even then he was using information that was already existing in the community. He was just thinking about it within himself. Okay, well, that concludes episode 2 of INTP Reasoning. I will be back soon, hopefully. Ciao.